Hi, everybody. Welcome back. We are here for another one of your questions about work. And for those of you who are here for the first time, I'm Roy. I'm a startup investor in the future of work. Sydney is one of my teammates, and we tackle one question every so often about practical dilemmas about work. You can find all the past questions and answers at thisisnotadvice.work, our compendium of thoughts from guests and others. And so, Sydney, today we're going to get a little self-referential in the question. So today's question is, I see some areas where my boss could improve. How can I give that feedback, Sydney, given that I am, kind of target of said feedback? Would love to hear any and all of your thoughts.
Sure. So I think this kind of trails off of the last one that we chatted about, which is how to support your boss or your team when they're coming back from vacation. It's the same idea of know who you're serving and know who you're talking to. So before giving feedback, I always like to take a beat to think about whether or not I'm taking it personally first, and also how I want to, if I am taking something personally, how I want to deliver it to the other, right? So let's say we work together. We work together very closely. So let's say maybe you Slack attack me one day. And so I will take that and say, hey, okay, is this something where I really dropped the ball? If it's so, then it's an opportunity for me to give feedback to myself, but also to you and say, like, hey, maybe I did lose this here, but this was not the way to communicate it to me. And by framing it so that it's more about the deliverer of the messenger instead of how the person is receiving it, it can help because it doesn't feel so personal. It doesn't feel like an attack. And in the workplace, this can be especially hard because we want to create safe and healthy and happy environments. And at the same time, sometimes things need to get done and sometimes they aren't being done the way they need to. And that is when a boss needs to step in and kind of say that. So it's this two-way street. I think that's pretty, that's my
Yeah,
short.
I think that's really well put. I'm curious, so I hope to be the kind of person who explicitly invites feedback, although it's always, I don't want to say always, it is often difficult to give feedback to somebody who has power in the workplace. How do you think about different workplaces? Like if you were in a workplace where the boss was, never inviting feedback, for example, how would you think about it?
So I think in these terms, usually a CEO of a company will have at least a COO or someone else that they are depending on, their partners, their trusted confidants. And so there's a way to go about having these conversations with that person's trusted confidants by saying like, hey, this isn't for you to go and carry water and go pass the messenger along. Do not play a game of telephone in your workplace ever. It's the worst thing to do. However, but communicating to those partners and saying like, I'm really struggling here. Can you give me advice on how I can give this
I love
person
that.
feedback?
I love that.
And that is a really good way to learn your team very well quickly as well, because you get 3 data points. You have your own personal experience, you have the partner's personal experience. And then when you go to your boss and say like, hey, this is what I'm struggling with that framing, you get to see whether or not it works for that unique specific relationship.
I love that. We got a follow up here from Michael Lord. What's a best practice for when you need your boss to step up for you? So from LinkedIn comments, and if you want to say more, Michael, as we respond, you can, but you need your boss. So sometimes feedback is you did something and it bothered me. And sometimes it's expressing that you have a request of something that is undone. Does that change how you would handle it, Sydney?
Sure. So I think one of the best example I can give real time with us, right, is that I know.
I love real-time examples. We're getting meta. Not capital M meta, lowercase m meta.
Right. Sometimes there can be friction around doing some more like nitty-gritty tactile, like we have to go through this list and we have to mark this off and we have to do that. And what I have learned is that there's always a time and a space for these things. And just because maybe it was on the agenda or maybe I thought it was important to include in that conversation, it doesn't mean it always is. And so you have to be flexible, right? So in this, what's the best practice for when you need your boss to step up for you? Create space for them to step up for you. Just going to them and saying like, hey, you're not doing this, or, you really like, we were supposed to do it last week, but it never got done. That doesn't do anything for anyone. Instead, going into the calendar and saying like, hey, here's 20 minutes where we could together work on this, where sometimes it just helps to have someone sit with you when you're getting through these things.
Well put.
And then, Yeah, that's just create space, communicate, and depend on your team when it comes to feedback, delivering and receiving.
Yeah, Michael's giving us a little more context here. What if it's a need for the CEO to defend their team?
Mm,
And, what I would say is that, there's a few ways I think about this, which is just to add to what Sydney, to what you said, which I completely agree with, which is, what you're describing is experimenting with the timing and dosage of the request.
mhm.
And I think that experimenting is how you do it, because different people are going to listen in different ways at different moments. Sometimes explicit narration is really helpful. And so in any form of feedback, we've talked before here about the vampire effect of like, you need to invite them in the house. And so going to the CEO and saying, I would generally avoid the word feedback, because that word can sometimes be like code for like, I'm about to hit you in the head with a hammer.
Yeah.
But saying like, hey, I have a request for something that I think we could use as a firm for you to do differently. Are you open to hearing it? Something like that. And then once they've said yes, you got license, make the request. And so the vampire principle. And then the other one I just say is building on small wins, the animal trainer principle of like, if your CEO does something that defends the team a little bit against external stakeholders at like entitled LPs, then, what I would do is just in that situation, I would just, basically try to say, if they did a little thing, I'd say, hey, I noticed you did that. That was awesome. Like, really appreciate it. Would love if you can do that even more, that kind of thing. Those are good practices for change. And one of the best compliments I ever got in my life was professional life, not compliments, period, is I was talking on a conference call, and a friend of mine, a buddy from college, was sitting next to me in the car. And he said, after I hung up the call, he said, I don't know if you were talking to somebody who works for you or somebody who you work for. And that's exactly, I think, the thing to aspire to is, while you need to be aware of the context, it's not magically different just because the person is the CEO or has power over you.
Right. And that's kind of what I would say to this comment as well, is that if you need your CEO to defend their team and they don't really feel like really feel like they're doing that, ask your CEO what is going on, right? Like, what's happening? What are your thoughts around this? How are you feeling about this?
Love it.
Well, that your CEO is trying to navigate these own strategies and maybe could use a sounding board as well.
I love it. And then, the last thing I just say for my part is escalation. Sometimes, like a critical thing with feedback is to be really crisp with yourself about what is the goal of the feedback. Sometimes the goal is a requested change in behavior that you think will make the organization perform better or you performing better. Sometimes it's just them knowing where you are so that, you can feel like you're not hiding something. And depending on your goal, you may need different paths of action. So for example, if your goal is for your boss to change their behavior to benefit the organization, feedback to them might work, but at some point you may need to go to their manager. And I mean, that is an escalation. It may end up being nuclear, but one step at a time. Sometimes, people do public letters or whistleblow. I'm not recommending those things necessarily, certainly not in every case. But escalation is always an option as well. Feedback is never your only choice. Feedback is one critical tool. Oh, and one last thing I'd say, break the seal early, because the more often you give feedback, the more effective it is and the less of a big deal it is. If you've never given your boss feedback for 3 years and then you show up and you say you have something, it's like, whoa, it's a big event. But if you've given your boss feedback in the first 3 hours of your working relationship and every day since, and Sydney, I'm grateful for the fact that you find ways to give me frequent feedback, then it's more effective. You just got to keep doing it.
Absolutely. And I'm grateful that you're receptive to it, right? I think that's something to notice.
I try.
Not all, it
I
can
intend to be receptive to it, whether or not I am always receptive to it.
You're like a 9 out of 10. So that's all that matters.
No, that'll work. That'll work. It's good enough for venture capital. All right, Sydney, any parting thoughts before we wrap?
No, that's all. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. Yeah, no, this is great. I love when members of our team do this. And the reason we call it This Is Not Advice is because we're not telling you what to do. We're just sharing our own experiences. You got to decide. And again, if you want to look for the past episodes and write-ups of them, that's at thisisnotadvice.org, a comprehensive compendium on how to work, if you will. And thank you, Sydney, to be continued.
Thanks.
Bye.